I've got quite a bit of material to cover. The topic today, boost your wearable IQ, 7 ways emerging technologies humanize and elevate performance. When I'm talking about this, it's essentially, we're in the field all the time. I've been researching in this space out of the university for about 10 years and have been very intrigued by the changing nature of what we've been able to find and how we understand this world. So I'm talking about 7 key things, really, that you can take on board no matter where you are engaged in the wearable industry and consider both in how you operate and how you view the world around you. The 7 topics are there. I'm going to jump right into them because we might as well get going. Anthropocene is the first one, the golden spike. So this is the big picture. So humans have been on the Earth for less than 1% of the Earth's history. But for the last 11,700 years, we've been in an epoch called the Holocene, the recent hole. So all of humanity's recorded history has been one epoch until 2013. So kind of a pretty big moment. All of a sudden, all of humanity's history, one epoch. In 2013, the Royal Geological Society and globally the geologists got together and they said, yeah, it's new now. Officially, we've entered into a new epoch. It's called the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is defined by bio, cyber, environmental influence of humanity on the world around us. So we switch from a view of Mother Nature to Mother Human. We technologically begin to take control of our world around us. So when they declare epochs, they do things like with the dinosaurs, the Cretaceous epoch, meteor hits the Earth, there's iridium in the soil. When they find that iridium and they understand this is the moment when the dinosaurs disappeared and we entered into a new epoch. So they're digging down to try to figure out what are the things that define the shift in the epoch. What's interesting here is that, these 4 things I put there are the 4 key traces that they're currently using. So the nucleotides from the atomic bombs, plastic in the waterways, fertilizers in the ground, and the domestic chicken. These 4 things are the things that define the Anthropocene because these are the moments that humanity took control of the world. There was no domesticated chicken. Now it's the most dominant bird in the world. There was hardly any plastic at all in the waters. Now, as we know, it's a massive challenge that the world's undertaking. And fertilizers, obviously, and the nucleotides. These things talk about a transformation from a natural world to an electronic one or a digital world, a world of biotech, cyber. And the reason I raised that initially as a kind of key issue is because, when you talk about how we define the role that wearables might be able to play, we're really talking about the physical and the virtual worlds coming together. So, the first time I encountered this greatly was in the 1990s when Bill Gates bought the Corbis Collection, the most famous photography collection in the world, 80 million images, 99% of which we don't know who took the photographs. And he took all of those photographs and he wanted to save them and retain them for humanity. He wanted to create a post-humanist archive, something that would even outlast mankind. So he buried them in the middle of Iron Mountain in Pennsylvania in Slippery Rock, miles after miles of cold storage tunnels. And to this day now, those physical images are now essentially inaccessible to human beings. We will never again touch any of those 80 million images that are in that archive. And they've all been now subsequently digitally reproduced and will live on forever, eternally, even beyond mankind as a digital archive. And so as a golden spike, as a notification of the change of the epoch from 11,000 years, the Holocene, to the current Anthropocene, we can look at the shift from Homo economicus, or economic person, to Homo virtualis, or virtual person. The seamless transition between the virtual and the physical worlds, defining the moment at which humanity takes control of the world around us and takes responsibility for that control. And in so doing, embarks upon a world where there's a seamless integration between the virtual and the physical. And obviously, many of the wearable technologies we're looking at are defined by that kind of technological advancement. But specifically, we look at it now as as a really change in the way the mind works as well. So we have a change in the way that the world works around us, and then we have cognitive theories about how we as human beings exist and interact with the world around us. So traditional cognitive theories talk about systems and mechanisms inside the brain. The brain is an internal, computational, rules-based operational system. And in the last 25 years, predominantly, in neuroscience and cognitive theories, behavioral theories, structural theories, have advanced dramatically. And we have now a new understanding of the mind and the brain that talks about cognition that's developed through interactions of the brain, the body, physical environments around us, social environments that we engage in. So this is drawn from fields as diverse as human-computer interaction, evolutionary robotics, agent-based models, neural networks. As we begin to understand the way that the mind works in practice, we have these 4 E's: embodied, embedded, inactive, and extended. And these are incredibly relevant to the wearable technology industry and to the role that wearables play. So when you talk about embodied technologies, that's the mind expressed through the body. And if you're able to embody things, things become second nature. As you reach out to grab the coffee cup, you only have to think to reach out to grab the coffee cup, and the physical motion and so on is just automatistic. It's just part of who you are. You embody the concept of reaching out to grab that cup of coffee. So embodied things are like the felt quality of a smile on your face. It can't be divorced from how it is realized on your face. Once things become embodied and we understand the role between the mind and the body, we move to embedded. And embedded is really cool because, as cognition is always relative to the specific context in which it occurs. So it's talking about the idea that we can only achieve the highest levels or the highest reaches of our minds by embedding it with tools, language, logic, these kinds of accompaniments. So it doesn't just happen in the brain as if we're in a vacuum and operationally. What's happening is that as we engage, particularly with these kind of technologies, and we're embedded in a particular context, a worker is delivering a particular task in operations, and as they commence or engage in that task, the cognition that is occurring is directly related not just to the worker themselves, but to the environment in which they're operating. And those things can't be separated, and we call that an extended cognition. And this is very technologically focused today. So you have technology as a powerful force for scaffolding the mind, right? You can think about how the internet opened up its most basic capabilities, the way that we think and the way that we behave, and all of the studies now showing the impact that these technologies are having on our minds. You can have a simple example like an Alzheimer's patient in the home who then uses sensors and technology in the home to extend their cognition. So they may indeed be losing their memory. They may indeed be losing awareness of the environment around them. They have sensors that support and engage them that aren't separate and apart from the cognition that happens. They're able to sustain themselves and maintain themselves in this environment considerably longer as a result of extended cognition, not just as a result of being somehow supported or technologically augmented by these tools. It becomes part of how their mind works in practice. And that's the concept of an inactive system. So we have an organism and an environment, an ecosystem that operates as a whole. So the extended mind is default. We are not separate and apart from the environment around us. As we begin to use technologies to extend our reach into that world around us, it is no different than us, taking a pair of binoculars and looking up into the sky and being able to see further, or a telescope to be able to see galaxies instead of just stars and so on. The reaches that we obtain with the technology are phenomenal. And this is brought to life by wearables, VR, AR, sensory substitutes, mixed realities. The opportunities that these kinds of technologies provide are not just an opportunity to be more efficient or to operate differently, but an opportunity to extend our cognition, to extend our minds in this physical, virtual world that we're creating in the Anthropocene, the new epoch we just entered after 11,700 years of humanity. So there's a tremendous responsibility here. Heidegger talks about this idea about being there as predominantly what it is. So we are not just data or information processors. We're not just machines as human beings, but we're alive and we're immersed in worlds of significance. Things matter to us. And when they matter, we make different decisions about what we want to do. And that defines our humanity. And I do a lot of work with AI. I'm leading the research globally with Microsoft around AI research externally. And I've been working with Automation Anywhere and IBM. And as I've been encountering the different situations they face, you see this context problem all the time, the framing problem. As the situation changes, the machines struggle terrifically to prioritize or think differently about what matters. Significance is very, very difficult for the AI to adopt to. And so you see a kind of flattening, as it were, of that. You look at something like, how can you get people to recycle? And you try to convince them to recycle differently, and that's, in even the most successful environments, not more than 50% of the population following the highest standards of recycling guidelines and so on. Or you go to a Chinese new build city like I was in about 2 months ago, and you see it just built into the infrastructure of the city and machine learning algorithms driving it, and you drop it down the wrong tube and you're fined, and everything goes through the tubes, and there's no trucks on the roads, and there's no way to circumvent the system. There's nowhere to put that piece of plastic except in the right tube. And when you put it in the right tube, then recycling rates in excess of 90%. And they take human intelligence and make it more like AI intelligence. So it's always going to be a big challenge for AIs to mimic that framing knowledge, what matters to human beings. But the other alternative is to take away what matters and say, actually, I don't care what you think or feel about the environment, because these are the rules, and you follow this system, and we'll make sure that everything gets recycled around here. Now, the implications, of course, cascade in your life quite significantly. If you don't care about the environment, if the environment doesn't matter to you, and you're not recycling because it matters, but rather because it's the appropriate process to follow on the decision tree of recycling, then what are the implications for other areas of your life that intersect with nature? And these are the kinds of responsibilities that come with the Anthropocene, the kinds of things that we need to consider. I saw it most dramatically myself in Lego recently, so I've been doing quite a large-scale project with them around play and the impact of play, using wearables in the workplace to monitor workers, developing play interventions and trying to understand the impact of play on productivity, performance, well-being within the workforce. These are studies we've been conducting for 10 years. We've been experimenting with different wearables, getting different data sources. I finished the world's largest driving experiment with Shell a couple of months ago in 15 countries, doing something similar around drivers and trying to understand drivers. But in this case, we're looking at these workers and we're trying to understand what is the role of different interventions. If we do a creative intervention, a cognitive intervention, an emotional intervention, a social intervention, and we know their personality and we understand how they relate to both their job and others around them and so on, and we watch their physicality and they've got a chatbot and they're responding in real time, self-reporting their own feelings of stress, anxiety in the workplace. In this case, we use CVT, cardiac vagal tone, to monitor just a high heart rate monitor, essentially, to be able to monitor their rest and recovery and their movements into stress. And we saw remarkable things. A driver going through the situation, a guy saying, okay, you need to build a car, and when you roll that car, it needs to land between these two lines. So there's a cognitive task at the beginning, and then there's a physical task that follows. And this character is a bit of a savant, a bit of a genius, but extremely narcissistic and so on. Personality test comes back, quite a difficult individual, but capable of eureka thinking and so on. And sure enough, as you dig into the buckets to build the car, he's competing against 4 of his colleagues in this competition. And he builds the most beautiful and most efficient vehicle by some measure amongst the 5. But he's missing a block towards the end that he needs to finish it. And he's digging in the barrels and his CVT's going stress, 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 stress. And he's feeling a lot of anxiety around not being able to finish his masterpiece. Eventually finds the block, sticks the block on, gets into the race with the others. And it turns out that he's got terrible coordination, right? Physically not very adept. And there's another couple of guys that are part of this group and a couple people that are far more adept at that. And so despite the fact that he's got this beautiful car, they roll their clunky cars right in between the lines. He rolls it the first time, falls way, way, way short. Rolls it the second time, goes way long. Rolls it the third time, way short, right? The loser of the competition. Now, self-reporting, he's been saying all the way through that he's quite adept at physical skills, and we haven't seen that in action yet, but he's been rating himself 5 out of 6, 5 out of 6, 5 out of 6 as we poll him through the chatbot. How are you feeling physically? How physically adept are you at your tasks responsible for your job? Suddenly, as the car doesn't make it between the lines, his self-reporting starts to fall. 3 out of 6, 2 out of 6. He starts self-reporting a complete lack of confidence, and the CVT moves from acute stress, while he's looking for the brick, to chronic stress. He doesn't go back into recovery that entire afternoon. He just sits there in a state of anxiety and stress, defeated in his role, dehumanized. Now, we can watch all that, and then we can develop an intervention. We can understand the implications. Now, that's the same as walking into a meeting with a colleague and having the colleague demean you publicly in that setting, and you walk out of there and you say, oh, don't worry, they'll recover, you know. Nah, maybe not. Maybe they don't recover, and maybe that afternoon is nowhere near as productive or performance-oriented, and maybe it's no good for the well-being of the worker, and so on and so on and so on. And as we begin to understand these things, you know, we can develop interventions based on best practices and understand. And we couldn't do any of that without the data coming from the wearable, because the self-reporting mechanisms, in this case, massively misrepresentative of the reality of the situation. He's 5 out of 6 on physical. No, he's not. He's a 1 or a 2 out of 6 on physical, and the moment that he's exposed as a 1 or a 2 out of 6 on physical, his confidence and his self-esteem are destroyed, and his performance falls off a cliff. And we can see all that we couldn't see before. So they talk about making work human. It's a big concept nowadays. You know, lump of labor, technological unemployment. For me, that's the cat in the story. Pulitzer, when he was training reporters, would always wonder why they always put a cat in the story when a shipwreck would happen. There would always be a cat that escaped, you know? And then when they went back and tried to figure it out, and he's interviewing the reporters, Pulitzer of the Pulitzer Prize back in the 1920s, and the reporters are saying, well, listen, I did the story, and I put the cat in, and nobody else put the cat in, so they all got hit for not putting the cat in. Then the next shipwreck happened, and there wasn't a cat, and so I didn't put the cat in, but everybody else put the cat in because they'd seen the success I'd had with the cat. And so then I got chided for missing the story. So now if there's a shipwreck, we all put the cat in every time, right? And that's job losses and the hysteria around the notions that are occurring as a result of automation, augmentation, all of these technologies. There's so many things that are missing here. The economic response, obviously, but predominantly the human response, right? Why would we create a whole range of technologies to dehumanize and destroy the value of work, do that self-esteem thing that happened with that car on an almighty scale that just wipes out the productivity and performance of the economy as a result? So you see these routine cognitive jobs are dying and routine manual jobs are dying, and they have been dying since the early 80s significantly. And non-routine cognitive and non-routine manual jobs here in the US have been on the rise significantly since the 80s. And so yeah, humans are going to be doing non-routine cognitive and non-routine manual work, and machines are going to be doing routine cognitive and routine manual work, and humans are going to be doing non-routine cognitive work alongside machines and algorithms in augmented ways, and you know that is obviously the line of flight. And so, you know, good riddance to the jobs that were meant to dehumanize people and turn them into robots, right? Good. The robots are here, and let's be free and able to think about how we can apply that to those kinds of roles. I do a lot of work in healthcare practices. You get medical secretaries. That's a job, according to all those studies, that's 98% likely to be automated. What a load of rubbish. You go in and you see what the job actually involves, and you can see the portions of it that are going to be easily automated and augment that worker. And then you see all the time that medical secretary is spending with patient contact and relating to the socialization of that business and the way that it operates in practice, and none of which is going to be automated or augmented. And you say, oh, well, let's get rid of all that. Good luck having a medical practice. As a result, you lose all the value. So yeah, you can get more efficient, but it's a race to the bottom. S&P 500, 80 years in the 1930s, businesses were on there, 60 years in the 50s, 30 years in the 1990s, 14 years today, and by 2030, 70% of the businesses that are on the S&P 500 don't exist today, right? This race is a race to the bottom, a race to extinction. Just focus on the bottom line and efficiencies and ROI as the only indicator, and don't look at well-being and don't understand the value, not just value, but values. And you got right now 14 years to live, even if you're the biggest industrialist in the world. 14 years. You used to have 80. Life expectancy is falling massively. And they're getting more and more and more and more efficient and so on. It's not the only way. There's something much more to this. Here's a good example. An Amazon patent. Shift workers around the workplace in cages, put them on motorized, move them around, right? Hands poke out of the cage, maybe. Robotics. People in cages turn up for work, get in the cage. 4 hours later, take a break, get back in the cage. Yeah, that's going to work, right? You know, life expectancy. You got to be way more ingenious about how you harness the power of humanity, or this is not the game. This is a straight race to the bottom. 85 years in the 30s, 14 years today. 70% of the businesses don't exist today. And that doesn't mean they're all going to be super hyper efficient businesses that operate. I want to look briefly at mindset. This is really, really important to consider. What can you do, you know, both as entrepreneurs, as people that are developing new products, as people that are harnessing the power of this. So resilience is not meant to be the peak state of a human being. It's the default one. So I talked about the extended mind being default. You know, the Stoics were brilliant at this. They said, you know, if somebody comes at you and they're abusive, how do you handle that situation? You know, thank you for the opportunity to allow me to express my patience and understanding. Right? Or just elevate yourself like a beast, see your stress go through the roof, end up in a conflict. Like, you know, there's prudency to everything here. And the growth mindset is critical, in effect, for human beings, but also for leaders and people that are considering the implications of these technologies. It's a culture of experimentation because it adopts the notion of failure and integrates the journey as the crucial thing, but it essentially transforms things like resentment or conflict and so on into energy, to give you an opportunity to think differently about the challenges that you face. Self-esteem. So I do a lot of work. I mean, we've been working on self-esteem. When the first consumer wearables came out, we realized quite quickly that a lot of the reason that people didn't stick with the technology is because it was giving them negative reinforcement, right? So they would get data back. Oh, you've done X number of steps, you've done X number of steps, and you can't just always go up. And as you start to go down, I don't want to look at that device anymore. And people would take them off because it was damaging their self-esteem. Right? And that was kind of obvious, right? If the technology was there and all it kept reinforcing was things that they already knew about themselves, that made them feel badly about themselves, then nobody was going to wear a technology that did that, right? It's kind of obvious. I'm doing a lot of work with high finance at the moment, big investment banks, passive and active funds. And it's remarkable to see these titans of investment and finance brought to their knees by the implications of the passive and the algorithm and so on. As the passive funds start to outperform the active funds, what value the broker? What value the human being? And they start to feel really badly about themselves because they're experienced professional, they've been thinking, they're wise, they visit all the companies they go to, they think about all the variables that are included in their ethical funds, they do all of these things, and still they're outperformed. And so they're beaten. And they need self-esteem to reestablish. They need to understand that the value of what it means to invest maybe shouldn't just be ROI as the only outcome that's relevant. Is that possible to consider? And if we start looking at some of the other variables that might be important outcomes in relation to that, are those things that are just as easily mimicked without an augmented investment strategy where human beings are there to monitor and understand the implications? Disciplined innovation, I think, is something that most of you probably practice, but is obviously crucial in these spaces. As I've come to this event, I've been amazed by the evolution of the technologies in the expos, and they're getting better and so much more complete and thorough in the way that they evaluate and think through the implications of how these technologies can support and enhance people. I think disciplined innovation is at the key here because we've seen it over and over and over again. You can't just, think of everything and fail in everything and so on. It's not just a blue sky world and so on. And similarly, we can't just fall into the traditional patterns and so on. We need to be able to mix them. When I see it most clearly is in things like project management, where you have to have, clearly now waterfall and agile approaches integrated together, and that it wasn't ever a binary discussion, but it's actually needed to be a rich mix of ways of thinking. And I think on innovation generally, that rich mix is as crucial as ever. Economies of scale, you see the attention economy being talked about crucially. This is something that I think we need to look at quite carefully, because we've learned quite clearly you don't shift your attention from moment to moment, you shift it from thing to thing. Remember Heidegger and what matters. In an attention economy, it's not like people's attention shifts from moment to moment. It shifts from thing to thing, and you're prioritizing things. If you're at home and you're at the dinner table and one of your kids is screaming and you got a call coming in from work and you got all these things happening at the same time, your mind is very quickly prioritizing where to focus your attention. And that defines your humanity. That's what matters to you. And so you're prioritizing what matters, and that's the essence of the attention economy. We can't just look at the heat maps, where they're looking and why they're looking. It doesn't make a lot of sense unless we contextualize it in terms of what matters to them. And that's the huge opportunity that wearables have, to understand that in all of these different economies, which are emerging, which are basically economies of emotion, of humanity, and think about those in relation to that, passive, active challenge I mentioned, and the challenges of trust. We see it in accounting, so I see this a lot. There is a driverless audit that's kind of nearly ready now. So instead of doing intelligent sampling and auditing every quarter and getting small samples of data, you can just look at all the data all the time. And you have these algorithms that can go in and just, the audit is always on. It's never off. And as a result of that, you're immersed in the audit. It always exists. And what do you need your auditor or your accountant to do is to make sense of that, interpret it, help you, guide you, understand the strategy of the business, and so on. It's remarkable, but that kind of mirror that we have of everything that's going on reminds me of Borges' Exactitude of Science, where cartographers go off and they create a map of the world that's an exact replica, eventually, of the world. And then the map becomes useless. And then it ends up in the desert or something in his story. But the map's useless, of course, because we will never have a theory of everything. We will never capture everything. And therefore, what matters becomes so important again. Sure, I can have a driverless audit where the algorithms are tracking every transaction, but what matters about that? Who cares? I end up with a cartographer's map that's exactly the same as the real world, and then they become useless. Last thought here then around feminist techno-science. I think this is probably one of the most important philosophical things to consider, what Bourdieu calls habitus. So, the strongest critique of all this technology, and it is a very, 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 very powerful one, is just, white dudes trying to live forever and avoid redundancy, and heteronormality, patriarchal, paper white hegemony. And this is an enactment of it. This effort in the Anthropocene. So I was looking through, I do a lot of work in blockchain, for example. 2.8% of investment in blockchain comes from women. That's going to work, right? We talk about algorithmic bias, everybody gets it, but then all of a sudden you don't, well, what happens when we build a system that's 98% from a particular point of view, which is pretty outdated and part of the past and not the future? Diversity is probably the most important thing in the design of these systems. You get anthropologists, social scientists, humanities designing tools for humans that understand humans. If you have people designing technologies that are meant to deliver on efficiency and all the rest, and the calculations and all the rest, that's all part of the previous way of thinking. Of course, we need to account for those things, and they're very, very critical, but it's a race to the bottom. We don't account for the humanity. We don't account for what matters in that. And, I've been in Canada looking at this situation in detail. 94% of board directors in Canada think board diversity is extremely important. Women occupy 22.6% of board seats. 92% of board members say that their board are already sufficiently diverse. Okay? I think, there's a long way to go here in this, But realizing that you want to be part of that next wave, that way of understanding is embracing diversity and understanding the implications of building technologies that are relevant to all of humanity and come from all of humanity in the way that they operate and become real in our lives. It's a dichotomy, it's not a division, it's a branching. It's really important. I used to think it was this. I thought there was like a loop, a trajectory from augmented to automated. The reason I came across that was drone technologies in the military and observing how they had evolved and thinking, okay, we went from the joystick and the fire button to reports coming back to who knows what. As if you were moving from an augmented world to an automated world. Now, having exposed myself into all these different areas, I'm convinced that it's a branching. And just like in botany or in biology, it's not a division. And then when we speak of augmentation, we aren't talking of like people being augmented by tools and technologies. We are talking about what I referred to at the very beginning, the whole, being there. You and the environment, the 4 E's, the different way of thinking. And the last thought now, God's touch, really important to understand, I think, if we consider this in the wearables community. This one I encountered from AlphaGo. You know, we've been following the evolution of a lot of these AI technologies for quite some time. When Go was a wide open game, you know, the Go algorithm that was developed by DeepMind is now being used in airport security, solves the same kind of problem. Open worlds that are really hard to account for changing circumstances. We saw a situation there where AlphaGo was playing against Lee Sedol, the best Go player in the world. And in the third game, AlphaGo made a move so beautiful that it just destroyed Lee Sedol's confidence. Lee Sedol hadn't lost a Go game against a human being for 6 years. All of a sudden, he was wiped out. Not just wiped out, but astonished by the move that AlphaGo made. Later on, they looked at the probabilities. There was a 1 in 10,000 chance that a human being would make the move that AlphaGo made under the particular circumstances that AlphaGo made the move. And that's what broke Lee Sedol, was just, that's so different. That's so astonishing. I can't think like that. 2 games later, they start playing again. AlphaGo's been undefeated now, never lost a game of Go. Gets about halfway through, and Lee Sedol makes a move so beautiful, so astonishing, they call it God's touch, as if God had reached down and touched him on the shoulder. 1 in 10,000 chance, not just that any Go player would make that move, but that Lee Sedol would make the move. 1 in 10,000 chance, the same odds that AlphaGo demonstrated its excellence in the previous game. This time, AlphaGo gets broken, starts sweating, recalculating its probability tables. Holy crap, this guy can play. Right? Makes mistake, and AlphaGo loses to a human being. Later on, they talked to Lee Sedol afterwards. What happened? What was that? God's touch. What was that? He said, look, I was the best player in the world my whole life. I'm here, and I understood the ceiling of this game to be right here. And I'm right there. And suddenly I played against this machine, and I saw, I don't know where the ceiling was, but it sure wasn't here. It was just somewhere up there. And I changed the way that I started to think about the game. And I don't know where that move came from. I don't know where that way of thinking came from, but I know it came from a mindset and a way of thinking that was born from the idea that the ceiling wasn't here. And that it could be anywhere. And that meant I could be anywhere. And God's touch. That kind of augmentation, that kind of humanizing. Who cares if a human being never beats another algorithm at Go? Who cares? Look what happened to Lee Sedol. And the value that that interaction with that technology had on his way of thinking and his behaviors and his mindset. That's the opportunity all of you have in these technologies. We're in the Anthropocene. It's a massive opportunity, but it's also a massive responsibility. Okay, thanks very much.